Only 33.3% of being interesting is actually being an interesting person. So the remaining 66.7% is other factors which are within your control and which can be changed relatively easily without changing who you are or starting a million different hobbies. And that's good because there is demand for interesting people in our society. So many people are just relatively the same. There's like the gym bro clique, and that sucks because it feels like we've already met everyone. When we're talking to someone new, we're like, oh, really, really, you do this? But if you can be interesting, if you can break the mold, you're going to be like a warm, glowing light in the middle of a dark cave. People are going to be drawn to you like moths. But like I said earlier, you don't need to fundamentally change who you are to become an interesting person. You need to make use of the other 66.7% to become that standout person who everyone loves talking to. So let me explain this whole 66.7% thing. There are three things that make someone interesting to talk to. They have to know or do interesting things, they have to listen first, and then they have to enthusiastically tell people about those interesting things they do or know. So those three things are equally important, which means that if you improve the second two, if you improve how you act in conversations, you're going to be way more interesting. So I'm going to start with the third thing that makes you interesting, which is telling people about it enthusiastically. To be interesting, you need to tell people interesting things, whether that's facts or stories. I know, shocker, right? But most people in conversation don't do this. And the main thing that's limiting us is that we feel like we're going to be talking too much and we're going to be boring people if we give some long story. But there is a tip for this, which is to give the appropriate amount of detail. You want to start with a really short story and then gradually give a longer one if people respond well to the first bit. And the main reason people don't do this is they feel like they're just going to bore the other person out of their mind. They're going to be like, oh, this guy's telling such a long story, when's he going to shut up? So people avoid it altogether. But there is a safe way of doing this, which is to give people a little taster before you give them the full story, just to see if they like it. Just like you would in a restaurant where, they bring out the, a 5-star restaurant, they bring out the little appetizer, they've got a little bit, you taste it and you're like, ooh, that's good. I'll have some more, please. With the wine and stuff, they give you a little wine taste. You can do the same thing with stories or facts. You give a little one-sentence taster. If the other person seems really interested, then you unload the whole story or the whole fact or thing you know. I'm going to give examples in a second, but another thing you can do is you can just ask, do you want the short version or the long version? The short story or the long story? And later I'm going to talk about listening first. That will also touch on, how to not bore the other person out of their mind by talking for too long. So hopefully that will help you be able to tell stories. But then what do you actually say? Well, stories should be about personal experiences, and that may include a conversation you had with someone. You don't really want to tell stories, long ones at least, about someone else's experience. So you might not go like, oh, my friend, bro, it was such a crazy story. He went skydiving this one time and his parachute didn't open and he had to use a backup parachute. You wouldn't really do that because you weren't there and it wasn't really related to you at all. Another thing with stories, you want to include lots of dialogue so that you're actually reliving the story rather than just going, oh, and then I did this and then I did this and then I did this, because then it becomes a bit monotonous and boring. And with stories, it's pretty easy to give a fairly long story. You just tell them what happened, right? When it comes to facts though, you can just keep giving related facts. So, you don't have to, with the one sentence taster thing, if you just say, I don't know, you can't fold a piece of paper in half 7 times, that's a fact. If they seem interested, you can keep giving related facts to that, if you know any, or you can go on some tangent a little bit if it's on the same topic. So you can kind of lengthen your responses a little bit that way. And this isn't just saying anything you can think of, say it if you actually have something interesting to say. Okay, so here are some examples of stories and facts, starting with the one sentence taster and then going into full detail. So for facts, this is actually copied from someone else. I had a 5-minute conversation the other day about echidna penises. I'm keeping this purely, this is for scientific information, for interest purposes, okay, not for entertainment. Anyway, so here's the one sentence summary. You can either say it as the fact or as a question. Hey, did you know what an echidna penis looks like? Have you seen them? It's crazy. And then if they go, wait, no, I haven't, and they look interested, you go, damn, you should see these. They've got 4 heads. So it's like this. They've got 2 for sperm and 2 for peeing, and they like use them interchangeably. No idea why they need that many. I don't know what's wrong with just 1, but they have 4. And their like sperm swim together in like a ball, right? And then when they get close to the egg, they like break off and like race. So it's like every man for themselves. Weird. Anyway, slight tangent. I gave the 1-sentence summary, then I unloaded more information, which was interesting. Next example for a personal story. You talk about the time you went skydiving. So maybe you want to go, maybe you're in conversation. The 1-sentence summary might be, oh, I went skydiving one time. And people might be like, oh, really? How was it? Or they might be like, nice. And then you wouldn't continue. So that's just like your basic story. And then if you want to give a story about a conversation with someone, so this is kind of as close as you can get to giving a story about someone else. You kind of are giving a story about someone else, but you're telling it from your perspective. So the 1-sentence summary, bro, I met this guy the other day and he told me the craziest story I've ever heard. It was, oh my God. And then if they seem interested, I mean, don't over exaggerate it, but you know, if they seem interested, this one is also made up. Yeah, so I was just at this bar, right? And there was this guy who like wheeled up next to me in a wheelchair. And I was like, oh, what's up? And he was like, oh, what's up? And I was like, what happened? You look very fit. You don't look like you've been in a wheelchair for long. And he was like, oh yeah, like it's actually only been like 6 months. So you want to hear the story? And I was like, yeah, tell me. And he was like, all right, so I went skydiving, and this guy was so weird. He told me he went skydiving with an echidna, and he dropped the echidna on the way and it flew up and punctured the parachute. And so he like fell because he was already close to the ground. He told me he like fell and broke both his legs, and now he's in a wheelchair. Crazy guy I've ever met. I've never seen anyone like that, but I guess it just goes to show you just gotta ask people questions and learn more about them, and you might hear some crazy story like this. So that would be how you basically tell someone else's story, but from your perspectives, so that it actually, you know, is fair that you're saying it and people will be interested. And another thing here is that you need to have the right people. Like sometimes, I guess would be another thing of being interesting, is that you need to have people who are interested in you. And this is not saying, like, I'm sure you already know this and you're trying to find people who are interesting, but it's just a note, like, if you're watching this video because you do these tips already and it just feels like no one really wants to listen to you too much, you may just need to put more effort and sacrifice more to find people who find you interesting. So like, it is hard. Yes, there's like other things you could be doing. You could be studying more, you could be working more, but maybe if this is important to you, you just need to sacrifice more, put more effort into your social life. I don't know, that's what I'm doing personally anyway. Okay, and then the other part was telling people enthusiastically. So when you're telling these stories, I did this with my examples just then, you've got to be like, oh, this is so interesting. Do you want to hear this interesting story? You can't just be like, hey, do you want to hear this story? Because when you tell people stuff, you tell them the information, and with your, you know, your body and your facial expression and tone, you also tell them how to react to that information you just told them. So if you tell people, hey, do you want to hear a story? They're going to assume this is not an interesting story. Whereas if you go, hey, do you want to hear this story? I've said the same thing, but now people go, oh, this must be an interesting story. Yes, I want to hear it. And you can also just add stuff with your words. You can be like, oh, the craziest thing happened to me the other day. So you can do it that way. And you don't want to over exaggerate, but if you're watching this video because people aren't finding you that interesting, maybe you need to do a little bit more of this, and as you go a bit more out of your comfort zone when doing this, be a bit more like exaggerated, you'll find the right zone, the middle ground, the Goldilocks zone. So that was the third part, which is tell people enthusiastically about the interesting stuff you know or do. Okay, and then the other 33.3% was listen first. So listening is like watering a garden. You have your watering can, and if you just pick up your watering can and go to water the garden, there's no water in there. So it's not going to work, is it? What you need to do first is you need to go to the tap and you need to fill it up. Now you don't need to fill it up the entire way and then carry this heavy can around. You can just fill it up a little bit. Go to the garden, water the garden, go back, fill it up a little bit. Or you can fill it up the entire way and then you can get all of it in one go. And it's just like that when it comes to conversations. You need to fill up your watering can first. In other words, you need to listen first, because that's building up people's kind of interest in you. When you're interested in someone, especially for like a longer period, they're going to be like, oh wow, this guy really likes me. And then they're going to turn that around and they're going to be, okay, I've talked enough, your turn. and they're going to ask questions to you. They're going to be actually interested in you. If straight out of the gate you just start telling all these stories when you've shown no interest in them, they're not really going to care. So you need to fill up your watering can first. And you can just be really interested in them for like a long time, and that's going to fill up your watering can further. Or you can just be interested in them for a little bit, ask questions a little bit, and then you can tell a little bit. But you can't ask questions for a little bit and then tell a lot, because you'll run out, you've only filled up a little bit. And obviously, there's no such thing as an infinite watering can. So you can't just fill up the tap and just turn it on and come back like a day later and you've got like a ton of water. No, it only fits a certain amount of water. So after a certain point, turn the tap off and go water the garden. And just like listening, after a certain amount of listening, you're not building people's interest in you anymore. So now it's time to talk. Otherwise, it feels a bit like a job interview and like you're a bit weird. So talk a little bit once you've filled it up a lot. And you don't have to fully empty it once your watering can is full. You can just empty it a little bit, fill it up a bit, you know. So then there's the first part I said, which is the 33.3%, which is do and know interesting things. So I am going to go over this, even though most of this video is about the 66.7%, which you can change pretty easily. When it comes to doing interesting things, pretty self-explanatory, but another part is also knowing interesting people and hanging out with them. So like I said earlier, like that story about the guy in the wheelchair in the bar. If you do stuff like that, you're going to meet interesting people and you're going to have stories about that as well. So that's another thing you can do. You can just hang around people more. And then when it comes to knowing interesting things, also pretty self-explanatory. What I would say for both of these though, is that you shouldn't force yourself to do something just for the purpose of becoming more interesting. You will be able to find something that you genuinely really want to do personally and also makes you more interesting. And if there's nothing, if you're just kind of a boring person who doesn't want to do any of these unique things, then don't do them. I would encourage you though to just try to be your own person. Try to not follow advice as like the only thing you do, just follow other people's advice, because then you're not really being your own person. And try to keep experimenting with, you know, trying new things. So you will feel like you've tried everything, right? You've tried every hobby. But if you keep going for like months longer, you will find new stuff. Now, I know this because I personally thought I'd found like every possible way to meet people and make friends. I kept looking and I found like another 10 ways. So you haven't exhausted the list, okay? There's always more stuff you can do. Hopefully now you'll be a much more interesting person without really changing who you are. Although I did briefly touch on how to change who you are to become more interesting as well. A lot of becoming a really fun, interesting person to talk to though, evidently can be done by just listening more and by enthusiastically telling people about the stuff you do. So if you want a video on how you can kind of listen better, I've actually got another video on that, which is over there. But you should probably consider just stopping, taking some notes on this one first. So I hope this helped. Have a great day.